I'm happy to introduce our guest today. Dr. Michael Grandner is a licensed clinical psychologist, board certified in behavioral sleep medicine, and he's the director of the Sleep and Health Research Program at the University of Arizona and director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Program at Banner University Medical Center in Tucson. Dr. Grandner is an associate professor of psychiatry, psychology, medicine, nutritional sciences, and clinical translational science at the University of Arizona. He's an internationally recognized expert in sleep health, has over 150 academic publications, and frequently consults with health, technology, athletics, and nutritional companies and organizations regarding sleep health and performance. So thank you, Dr. Grandner, for joining us today. I'm going to turn off my video and hide in the background, but feel free to start your presentation, and welcome to our speaker series.
Sure, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking to the OLLI community again. I really think that sleep is something that's universal. It connects all of us. And I think that it's important that we talk about it as a community and as people, given our experience. And you know, sleep may be universal, but the pandemic is also equally universal. And I think it's really important to talk about how everybody, almost to a person, has been impacted by the pandemic, and in particular has had at least their sleep and daily rhythms been impacted by the pandemic as well. I think this is a universal, global, broad phenomenon that I really I'm glad we're talking about. So the context here is this natural experiment that none of us consented to. So a natural experiment for the non-scientists in the audience is an experiment that nature conducts, that we are just unwilling participants in. And I think it started out, you know, with this idea that there was this virus, but it was sort of an outside the U.S. problem. But then, you know, it sort of came home, and you know, it was very interesting, and there was a lot of fear around it. There was a lot of stress, and I put this on here jokingly because it created a lot of societal change very, very quickly, especially in the months of March and April into May. But then we sort of get these other issues where the pandemic was influencing our basic ability to conduct business as usual, and how we deal with this as people and as humans and as families. And then as it went on, then we started getting this COVID fatigue. And it wasn't just we're all in this together and we're dealing with this, but we had this issue. And then, you know, then there was all this confusion around testing, and then there was all this push to developing a vaccine and the uphill climb that scientists were facing. And then as a society, we're dealing with all of this. Here, let me go back a little bit. That one's. So then as a society, we're dealing with all of these other issues that we're sort of in together, trying to find our way out of the stress of COVID. And then that brought us to, you know, the fall and the winter months, when we're trying to maintain our distancing and keeping apart. And then sort of where we are now, where we're a year into this thing, and we're still trying to deal and cope and reorganize our lives around this. So, and I know there are a lot of people out there who sort of feel this way, like, oh, another Zoom. But just also imagine if this was 10 years ago and this technology didn't even exist. I think that we're in a better position now, and you know, we are where we are, and we're making the best we can of it. But this is led into our bedrooms and into our sleep period, and this is what I want to be talking about. I think the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic infecting not just all the people it has, but also our bedtime routines and our sleep is something that a lot of people are experiencing. So clinically, what am I seeing? What people are talking about are things like difficulty detaching at night, things like difficulty with awakenings at night, people reporting waking up more at night than they used to, or waking up and having a hard time getting back to sleep. People talking about altered daily activity rhythms and patterns of light exposure where the rhythms of their day are changing. And also people talking about vivid dreams and nightmares. And these are all, this is what people are talking about. It's anecdotal, it's not data. And so then the question is, what do the data actually show? And there have been a few studies. I mean, there's more and more and more coming out every month. And as a sleep researcher, I'm one of many who took to the pandemic to try and wrap our head around what's going on. So here's a study by Pessin and colleagues showing that people with more COVID-related stress, especially whose stress increased highly during the pandemic, were sleeping less. They were taking longer to fall asleep. They had more nighttime awakenings. Their rhythms were disturbed, and they had more nightmares. I mean, this lines up perfectly with what I was seeing clinically and what everyone's sort of talking about. People are sleeping less, it's disturbing their sleep, and their nightmares are increasing. And particularly, the people whose stress increased, this is what they're dreaming about. A lot of them are dreaming about the virus, or they're dreaming about death and work, or friends, or crowds. But when people whose stress has not increased or whose stress was lowered during the course of the pandemic, they're still dreaming of people, about the virus, about their work, but at lower rates. And I'm going to present some data later that follows up on a little bit of this. A little bit about mental health change and insomnia. So here's some data from Kochevska et al., where they looked at the change in insomnia scores during lockdown, looking at how insomnia changed relative to where they were when they started. And what you can see on the bottom is when they divided people into three groups. Either they started out as good sleepers, they had some sleep problems, but not great, and they had people with insomnia at the outset, and how that's impacting their mental health. So at the top, you could see that on average, the higher their pre-pandemic insomnia scores were, the less change they had. Or if anything, they might have even gotten a little bit better. But the better sleep they had beforehand, the worse it ended up getting. So you can see the people whose scores were the highest all the way on the left, they're the ones who are most likely to have a clinically relevant worsening in their ISI scores, their insomnia severity scores. And the people who had the most insomnia on the right-hand side were the ones more likely to actually be sleeping a little bit better. And we'll get into a little bit potentially why. And it also impacted mental health, where the ones who were the best sleepers at the outset had the most worsening of their mental health during the pandemic, where the ones who had the worst insomnia at the outset didn't really have much of a change because they were already pretty bad to start out. Here was another study that came out. I think this is also European data, showing that level of anxiety was associated with worse sleep. So if you had worse, more stress and more anxiety, you had worse sleep during the pandemic. All right, so getting back to what we were talking about, COVID sleep health. So here's a study that was run by Scott Kilgore here at the University of Arizona, looking at COVID-19 related fears and increased suicide ideation. And one of the things he showed was that there was a strong relationship, but that it was mediated by insomnia, in that the degree of insomnia that was caused by these COVID-19 related fears was actually driving this increase in suicide ideation, just showing the importance of poor sleep in this relationship between the pandemic and mental health outcomes. Here's a study from Wernick et al., also looking at sleep and behavioral health, showing that that as sleep quality got worse, they showed that physical inactivity increased, more TV viewing increased, higher computer use also increased, and that mental health also played a role here too, as well as loneliness, sadness, and anxiety drove some of these relationships. Here's some data from Mass et al. Looking at sleep apnea and COVID complications, sleep apnea obviously being a very common sleep-related breathing disorder. And if you have a condition where respiration is particularly at risk, of course, you're likely to have more complications, showing that sleep apnea patients were 65% more likely to require hospitalization when they got COVID. And they were about twice as likely to experience respiratory failure when they were hospitalized. Here's a study out of Italy looking at sex differences in the relationship between COVID, sleep, and mental health, showing that men especially seem to be particularly susceptible to some of these changes, especially in sleep. Just showing that this is a complicated and evolving story. Talking about lifespan issues, here's some data in preschoolers showing actually that bedtimes on weekdays changed, wake times changed. They were actually sleeping on average a little bit more and maybe taking a little bit more naps during the day and getting more sleep across 24 hours. So for kids, the idea of not having to get up early to get to school and have some of these schedule disruptions may have been a good thing in terms of allowing the opportunity for some more or better sleep. And I'll talk about some of the adult data. And actually, what was also due to in the COVID sample versus the 2018 sample, they showed a reduction in overall sleep disturbance in terms of a reduction in bedtime resistance, or reduction in taking a long time to fall asleep, or an increase in how much sleep people were getting, a decrease in sleep anxiety, a decrease in nighttime wakings. So in general, it looks like the pandemic may have been good for kids' sleep, allowing them to get more sleep at a time that works better for them. Here's some data from college students from Ken Wright's lab in Colorado, showing that compared to baseline, college students were sleeping a little more, and in doing so, staying up a bit later. So the more they were able to sleep in, the more extra sleep they were getting. There's some data from Singapore showing something similar, where you could see the bedtime, you could see the fluctuation of weekday versus weekend, where people generally stay up a little later on weekends. And what you could see is during the lockdown period in Singapore, what you showed was a reduction in the difference between weekday and weekend sleep time. That people were sleeping slightly longer, largely because they didn't have to get up early for work, I guess. Where weekdays were starting to look more like weekends. But one thing you could see is physical activity started dramatically decreasing, and especially under lockdown, people were moving around a lot less. Here's some European data looking at sleep changes and sleep timing. So on average, people may have been sleeping slightly more. Again, looking at these data in adults, they're showing that actually social sleep restriction and social jet lag, which is when we naturally stay up later on weekends versus going to bed earlier on weekdays, and we're jet lagging ourselves on purpose by shifting our own time zones back and forth from day to day, that actually reduced over the course of the pandemic. And there was less socially driven staying up late. And sleep quality on average might have eked up a little bit on average, but there's a big variability here. Here's some data from a sample that included a whole bunch of different countries, mostly in Europe, but also in the US, showing that in a and the gains were mostly seen on weekdays. Again, you're seeing that the change in weekdays was bigger than the change in weekends, because weekdays might be starting to look more like weekends, where you're able to sleep in a little more because you have more control. Here's changes in how long it took to fall asleep. Again, the change, you see these changes across countries more on we ran looking at sleep-related changes and how it's related with stress and health and other things. This is very preliminary data. This is all still unpublished, but just want to give you a tour of generally what we're seeing. This is still preliminary, but here's a sneak peek of what we're seeing. First of all, physical activity change. So those who decreased their physical activity during the pandemic by at least 45 minutes were about 67% less likely to also have a more regular schedule, so that their schedules were less regular. And they were also much more likely to say that their sleep got worse. So the people who were much less active were much more likely to say their sleep got worse. And this is after adjusting for people who said over the pandemic their diet got healthier. They were more likely to have a more regular schedule as well due to the pandemic, and they were much more likely to say that their sleep got better. People who say they were been eating more processed foods during the pandemic were less likely to say that their schedule got more regular, but they were more likely to say they had more problems falling asleep than before. They were more likely to say they had more problems staying asleep, and more likely to say they had more problems with daytime sleepiness. Nighttime snacking during the pandemic especially seems to be an important issue, where those who said that they're having more nighttime snacks, they were less likely to say that their schedule was more regular, that their sleep was better, but they were more likely to say that their sleep was worse. They had more problems falling asleep, staying asleep, more problems with daytime sleepiness, and taking more naps during the day. So these are people with nighttime snacking. People who reported that they kept a more regular schedule during the pandemic were much less likely to report more daytime cognitive dysfunction due to the pandemic. People who reported more problems falling asleep due to the pandemic were 8.2 times more likely to report daytime cognitive dysfunction. Those who reported more problems with awakenings at night were 5.7 times more likely. Those who reported that they were sleepier as a result of the pandemic were 9.3 times as likely to report daytime cognitive dysfunction. And those who reported taking more naps were more than 4 times likely to report daytime cognitive dysfunction during as a result. Here's some preliminary data looking at infection-related beliefs and fears. So in the upper left, you have the likelihood of having a more regular schedule due to the pandemic because you had more control of your schedule. People who said that they had likely been infected were less likely. Everything that's glowing was statistically significant at the 0.05 level, but again, this is still preliminary. Those who said that they believed to have been infected with COVID-19 were less likely to be having a more regular schedule. People who were afraid of someone in their family getting infected were also less likely to have a regular schedule. And people who said they themselves were high risk were less likely to be keeping a regular schedule. In terms of sleep worsening, if you felt that you were infected or if you were afraid of becoming and if you're scared of COVID, each one of those was independently associated with sleep being worse due to the pandemic. Fear of testing was not associated, as you can see. Initial insomnia, difficulty falling asleep due to the pandemic was higher in also all these categories. People who believed they would have been infected or just were afraid of it, or had a family member they were afraid was going to get sick, or if they themselves or a family member was high risk, or if they themselves were scared of getting COVID. More middle of the night insomnia, though, was largely awakenings, maybe more fear driven. And daytime sleepiness, again, across the board, any of these infection and fear related variables predicted higher rates of daytime sleepiness that were worse during the pandemic. COVID-19 related general, financial, food, housing, family, and relationships were all associated with a decreased likelihood of maintaining a more regular schedule and a decreased likelihood of improved sleep due to the pandemic. So if you had any of these stresses, your likelihood of sleep and rhythms getting lower. They were also all associated with a greater likelihood of worse sleep, either from a 50% to 141% increase likelihood of worse sleep. Difficulty falling asleep, difficulty with awakening during the night, and more daytime sleepiness. And increased napping was also associated with more COVID-related financial, food, and housing stress. So I guess this goes to show that a wide range of stresses caused by the pandemic are influencing sleep. A little bit about dreams. Greater schedule regularity was associated with a 50% decreased likelihood of remembering fewer dreams. So let me preface this saying that when we asked about dream recall, we said, are you remembering more dreams than you used to, fewer dreams than you used to, or about the same? So you could have an increased or decreased likelihood of more and an increased, decreased likelihood of less versus same. So greater schedule regularity was associated with a decreased likelihood of less recall, not an increased likelihood of more recall, but a decreased likelihood of less. Increased likelihood of more and an increased likelihood of less. What that to me says that if your sleep was worse, it could go either way, but it's more likely to change. Same thing with problems with awakening during the night. They were associated with an increased likelihood of more dreams and an increased likelihood of fewer dreams. Again, what it's showing is sleep disturbance is taking it in both directions, depending on the person. Same thing with daytime sleepiness. If your dreams were more negative, you were much more likely to have more dreams and also more likely to have fewer dreams. If your dreams were less negative, again, you're more likely to have more and less dreams. So basically what this is saying is if your dreams got more negative, your recall was going to change. It could go in either direction though. And that might be why the data is a little wishy-washy, where some people it's leading them to dream more and some it's leading them to dream less. Same thing with positive dreams. If your dreams got more positive, it actually increased the likelihood of both more and less recall. Nightmares. More general COVID-related stress was associated with more likely nightmares about helplessness, anxiety, war, separation, totalitarianism, sickness, and apocalypse. More COVID-related family stress was associated with more likely nightmares death and apocalypse. So some of these things obviously are the same, but these COVID-related stresses were increasing the likelihood that people were going to have nightmares about these things. Those whose sleep got worse had more nightmares about confinement, depression, failure, helplessness, natural disasters, anxiety, war, separation, totalitarianism, sickness, death, COVID itself, and apocalypse. So all of these things were higher in people whose sleep got worse. People who had more problems falling asleep had more nightmares about a lot of these things as well. And those with more problems with nighttime awakenings, similarly, though fewer, had more nightmares about a range of different topics. So this is just showing that not only was COVID-related stress associated with more nightmares about certain things, but just worse sleep in general due to COVID was associated with more nightmares. A little bit from our Noches COVID study, where this is looking at the Noches study is the Nogales Cardiometabolic Health and Sleep Study, which is an ongoing study we're doing down at the US-Mexico border. During COVID, we did a sub-study where we looked at what was related to worse sleep. And so among those here down at the border in Arizona, those whose sleep got worse were more likely to believe they'd been infected, were more likely to believe they could possibly be infected, were more likely to fear testing, were more likely to believe COVID would impact their community and would do so for a long time. Those whose sleep got worse were more likely to have more general financial, food-related, housing-related, and family-related and relationship stress across the board. If your sleep got worse, your stress levels related to COVID also got worse. They were more likely to experience shopping that was impacted by scarcity. They were more likely to believe they're high risk. It was more likely that media coverage increased their stress. It was more likely to believe that there's too much panic. They were more likely to be scared of getting COVID. They were more likely to be worried about the future, feel less secure, more likely to be thriving less, and that their mental health was not getting better. So for people down at the border whose sleep was worse over the pandemic, they were more likely to have all these other issues as well. Those whose sleep and rhythms were improved during the course of the pandemic reported more positive dreams and fewer negative dreams. Down at the border, those with worsened sleep reported fewer dreams overall, fewer positive dreams, and more negative dreams. And those who experienced greater pandemic-related stress down at the border reported more nightmares. And they were more likely to have nightmares about confinement, suffocation, failure, being chased, sickness, and COVID itself. Now I want to talk about another study that we did, is just accepted in the journal Sleep Health. So this was a partnership between us and Fitbit, where we looked at Fitbit data from 6 major US cities. You can see here Chicago, Houston, LA, New York, San Francisco, and Miami, with an age and gender breakdown here. So we had representation across a lot of different age and sex groups across all these different cities. It was about 150,000 to 200,000 people. The first thing that we see here is that, so looking at the months of 2020, so this is looking through from February into March and April, sort of where the pandemic was taking off. And what we were looking at is, was sleep different? This is looking at how much people were sleeping. And you can see here, when you look at 2018 and 2019 data, in both men and women, you see a pretty typical curve where in the summer people are sleeping slightly less, very slightly, and they're right on top of each other. You could see that this is what normal looks like. But then you superimpose 2020 on there, and you could see right away there's a divergence in amount of sleep, breaking away from what was normal. Same thing in terms of this is so you could see here that, again, 2018 and 2019 data were pretty consistent in terms of how variable weekday and weekend data were. And you could see that variability starts decreasing, where weekend and weekday data are coming together. Here's some data on changes to sleep duration and bedtime. On the left is based on their Fitbit data, so you could see separated by men and women across age groups, looked at totally separately, who slept more and who slept less. What you can see is about a third of how much they were sleeping. And you could see more people slept more than slept less. So there was about 1 in 5, to 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people ended up sleeping less due to the pandemic. But about a third of people or more were starting to sleep more during the pandemic, especially if you were younger. You can look at that age gradient, that the younger you were, the greater increase in your sleep during those months. So this is looking at April versus January, sort of peak pandemic stay-at-home time. And you could see on average, people are sleeping more, but it's not that everybody's sleeping more. A third of people aren't changing, and about 20 to 25% of people are actually sleeping less. A half an hour more than they did before. On the right-hand side, you see changes in bedtime. So this is, are people staying up later? Again, you can see about 20% of people are actually going to bed earlier than they used to. About 25 to 35% are going to bed around the same time as they used to, but a lot of people are going to bed later, and especially if they're younger. The younger adults, 18 to 29, more than half of them are going to bed at least 15 minutes later. And at least about 40% of them are going to bed at least a half an hour later than they used to in April versus January. So you can see here, on average, people are staying up later. But it's not that everyone's staying up later. It's that in general, the younger people are staying up more later, and some people are going to bed a little earlier, staying the same.
All right. So this slide, just to go over it again, sort of quickly, you have 2 figures here. On the left, you have the changes in how much people are sleeping based on their Fitbit data due to the pandemic, divided by men and women by age group. And on the right, you have changes to bedtime in men and women separately divided by age group. One thing you can see is on average, people may be sleeping slightly more, but it's not that everybody's sleeping more. What you see is about a third of people are sleeping about the same as they were within 15 minutes, and about a fifth to a quarter of people are actually sleeping less than they were, with about 10 to 15% getting at least a half an hour less than they used to. But you can see the larger group is at the top of people who are getting more sleep than they used to. And so that's where you have the average trending to slightly more sleep. But you could also see it's different by age, especially the younger people are getting more sleep versus January, as they're in the pandemic in April, compared to the older adults who, again, might be more mixed, but it's trending towards more sleep in the younger adults. So in people 18 to 29, about a third of them, 27% of men and 32% of women, were getting more than a half an hour more sleep than they did pre-pandemic in January. On the right-hand side, you can see bedtime difference. And you can see, again, on average, people are staying up later, but it doesn't mean everyone's staying up later. A lot of people aren't changing their bedtime. You can see in the middle in yellow. And on the bottom in green, you could see people who are going to bed earlier. These are, there's still people who are going to bed a bit earlier than they used to, but not as many as who are staying up later. And you can see the majority of people here are staying up later than they used to, especially the younger adults, where more than half of the people under 49 are staying up at least 15 minutes later than they used to. And 35 to 40% of people under 49 are staying up at least a half an hour later than they used to. So you can see here that on average, people are trending to more sleep and staying up later, but it's not applying to everybody equally. Here's a graph that shows this. Here's the change in February, March, April, month-to-month change from the start of the pandemic into sort of the peak stay-at-home orders in the two extreme age groups of 18 to 29 versus 65 and up. You can see 65 and up, you can see there's a slight trend going toward the right, and it's spreading out more. See, the curve is getting flatter. That means there's just more variability at either end versus in the middle, even if the tip isn't really moving an average in one direction. Or on the left, you see in the youngest adults, 18 to 29, not only is the curve flattening a little bit, where it means more at the extremes than in the middle, so more people are sleeping less and more people in general are sleeping more, but the whole peak is shifting to the right, that on average, people are getting slightly more sleep. Here's another depiction of this day by day during the week. You can see Monday through Friday, and then you have the weekend days, where on average, especially in January and February, you see that people are more likely to sleep more on weekends. But then you can see going into March and into April, where some of the peak stay-at-home time was, the difference between those weekend peaks and the weekday base levels was decreasing, especially in the younger people. You didn't see it as much in the oldest group of 65 and up. Their weekends and weekdays didn't really change much. But the ones that started out the most extreme, the 18 to 29-year-olds and the 30 to 49-year-olds and even the 50 to 64-year-olds, you can see those weekday sleep times creeping up. So that's where the gains in sleep time were occurring, were during the week. This is also staying up later. On average, across groups, you see everyone on average was staying up a little bit later. You have January and February, which are right on top of each other. This is the normal weekday weekend pattern of Monday through Sunday. But then you can see what happened in March and April as people were staying up later and later, especially on weekdays, and more so in people who are younger. Here is the change where you can see that you can see here in 18-year-olds, 18 to 29-year-olds, you could see that the shift slightly to the right. Same thing in women. So you have men on the left, women on the right. You can see this variability is shifting slightly to the left, which means the weekdays and weekends are coming together a little bit, and the curve is getting shorter, which means there's more variability on the outsides than in the middle. What happened to sleep stages data from the Fitbit? Again, sleep stages data for these wearables is mostly a rough ballpark. It's not very precise, but it can give you a general idea of what's happening, especially if it's consistent with what we'd expect. On the left-hand side, we see how much awakening there was occurring during the night. And so you can see January, February, no real change, but going into March and April, awakenings were increasing. So there's more awakening during the night, in addition to staying up later and sleeping slightly more. On the right hand, you see what's sort of happening with REM sleep. Again, this is more flat and more variable, but you can see on average, there's a general increase in REM sleep, which will happen when you stay asleep a little longer and a little later anyway. So that's not surprising. It's just good that it showed up because that's what one would expect. Might also have something to do with the dream-related changes because those are mostly occurring in REM. Here's an image looking at what was predicting the sleep change. So you have minutes of REM in men and women on the left and on the right. And you can see, well, what was predicting the change in REM sleep? And what you're seeing is, well, does it have to do with when they're going to bed? Is staying up later and when you're going to bed, is that what's impacting your sleep opportunity and your sleep staging? And it looks like that's the case, where if you're going to bed earlier, you're going to be getting more REM and sleeping more. If you're going to bed later, you're going to be getting less, and you're going to have change in the other direction. I'm not going to go through all the numbers on this image, but this is looking at how are all these things correlated with each other. So obviously REM minutes and REM percent are correlated, and deep sleep minutes and deep sleep percent are correlated. But it's interesting that REM minutes was correlated pretty highly with average sleep minutes. So the more sleep you're getting, the more REM you're going to have, which makes sense if REM's more at the end of the night and you get more REM as you spend more time asleep. So for example, it's showing how all these things are sort of interconnected with each other. Something else that we found in this data set was that changes in sleep were also associated with health-related changes, because sleep is important for health. And even this very slight change in sleep, so on average, people were sleeping maybe 10 minutes more per night. All of this is about a matter of minutes. It's not hours difference. So the average change was maybe about 10 minutes, depending on the age group and things. So how did that correlate with changes in heart rate? Well, here you have, on the left, you have 2020. On the right, you have 2019 as a comparison, because that it changed wasn't important. It's how did it change relative to how we would have expected it to change. So you can see here in men and women across these age groups, resting heart rate decreases from January to April. It normally does. So the change in 2019, you can see here, was about a third, 0.2 to 0.4 beats per minute. It goes down from January to April. This is the reliable change, the seasonal change. As you go from winter to spring, your resting heart rate decreases slightly. Now, what did it also decrease in the same way, January to April of 2020? Well, what you can see here is this 0.2 to 0.4 range is nothing compared to what we saw in 2020, which was a 0.6 to 1.1 range. So it's double or more of the change, double to triple in terms of the decrease in heart rate. So first of all, we're showing that heart rate decreased in 2020 more than it did in 2019. And so then we can see, okay, well, what correlated with this change in heart rate? Well, one of the things that correlated with this change in heart rate was change in sleep. So, and this, we looked at it separately across all the age groups, and it was pretty consistent that as you slept more, your heart rate went down more. The more your sleep changed in terms of getting more sleep than you did in January, the more your resting heart rate decreased. Also, not surprisingly, the more your active minutes increased, the more you advanced your bedtime. So the more you went to bed slightly earlier, the more steps you got, and the less variable your sleep was. All of those separately correlated with reductions in heart rate. So not surprisingly, the people who were more active during the pandemic, their heart rates lowered more. But interestingly, the ones who slept better had a reduction in heart rate. So you'd think, is 1 beat per minute in your heart rate even worth it? So you made a slight change of your sleep of, on average 8 to 10 minutes, and it resulted in 1 beat per minute change on average in your heart rate. Well, at first that might not seem like much, but you're talking about a chronic change. You're talking about 8 minutes per night, every night, over months that it can accumulate. And 1 beat per minute can be the difference between being high risk or not, especially if it's trending you in the right direction. If it just goes to show that even a very small change in sleep might have a positive impact on health, at least going in the right direction. What's also interesting here is when we look at the data from May and June, after a lot of the lockdown stuff got lifted and everything sort of started opening back up again in this sort of half-open way, what you can see is when you take April, which is trending in the more sleep direction in men and women, and then you look at it compared to May and June, you could see once things start opening up and people start having to go back to work and things, you start returning back to where you were back in January. So these changes can be very fleeting. And once society changes, it'll be interesting to see what sticks and what doesn't stick. I do want to talk about this other study that recently came out, which was led by a colleague, Rebecca Robbins, at Harvard, where she looked at smartphone data. And she found the same thing, that on average, you had 2019 versus 2020 data, and there was a sharp divergence in March in terms of people sleeping slightly more. She had different cities where we had, where we didn't have international cities of London, Seoul, and Stockholm, but it's a similar pattern, at least in most of the cities where you have this divergence right around March. I want to talk a little bit about the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine's COVID-19 recommendations. So here is a paper where we basically, as a sleep organization, what are our guidelines for sleep during the pandemic? And just to briefly, it's a freely accessible document online. You could search for it. In the document, there were some recommendations, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. But just to give you a tour of what's in here. So there's some tips on managing new onset or acute insomnia. So if you didn't have insomnia before, now all of a sudden you're spending extra time in bed or you're more stressed, you might develop an insomnia. So you want to remember stimulus control, which means you get out of bed if you can't sleep. That will prevent long-term problems. You adopt behavioral and environmental controls. There's Jay Ellis's approach of detect, detach, distract. The paper talks about those and cites those as something to deal with new onset insomnia. You assess for maladaptive coping strategies. Is there anything you're doing that's making things worse, which often happens with insomnia? And then you enhance resources for coping with daytime stressors. Obviously, if you can reduce your stress levels, you can prevent things from taking hold. If your schedules become delayed or irregular, you want to encourage developing consistency where possible. Go outside for bright light in the morning. Establish social, dietary, and exercise routines because you want to set a rhythm for your day. And you want to avoid screens at night. If you're developing more nightmares, you want to recognize and address the causes such as stress. You want to limit exposure to triggers and do some physical relaxation when you wake up from a nightmare to help minimize its impact. Telehealth is blossoming in the pandemic. A lot of sleep interventions via telehealth can be very effective and should be utilized. Sleep is tailor-made to remote-based interventions. Our clinic here is totally online. We're seeing only people through virtual visits, and it's working really well, even if delivered to groups. So even online groups can be very useful as well. For kids, for people with kids and teenagers, during this time, you want to prioritize the parent-child relationships, especially if everyone's stuck at home together. You want to manage expectations where maybe they're going to be on screens more, maybe they're going to be up a little bit later, maybe they're going to be a little more irregular, but so is everybody, and there'll be time to get back into a routine, but you don't want things to totally fall apart either. You want to encourage activities that build sleep need, like getting time outside, and you want to discourage activities that lead to sleep disruption, like screens and naps. When you're dealing with older adults, you want to recognize the impact of home confinement or inactivity and social isolation. All these can take a major toll on the health and mental health of older adults. You want to establish activity and light exposure routines, especially in the early part of the day. That can help set their rhythms for the day. You want to encourage communication and social interaction, and you want to avoid excessive napping because that'll disturb sleep more at night. A little bit of napping might be fine, but you don't want to be napping too much. For stressed workers, you want to be as well rested as possible because getting good sleep is important. You want to make sure you're prioritizing it just as much as you're prioritizing at least anything else. You want to set yourself up for optimal sleep by removing barriers by not doing things that will get in the way of good sleep, but we can talk about that if you have questions. If your schedule is disrupted by long shifts and sleepless nights, you want to get sleep where you can. If you're on a crazy work schedule right now, if you're working in the hospital on 24-hour shifts or whatever it is you're doing, you might want to utilize napping to make up for some lost sleep. But when you're able to sleep, try to protect it. Especially if you're sleeping at odd hours, you're especially stressed, block out light, block out noise, block out other distractions, and insulate your sleep. Do what you can to protect the sleep of others as well, especially if you're working shifts and working odd hours and there are other people at home. Try and protect their sleep as well. If you can't sleep, get out of bed. Stimulus control. This is probably the best bang for your buck thing you can do for your sleep, is not set yourself up for worse sleep problems later. If you are in bed and you can't sleep, get out. You're not doing yourself any favors. And when you have to stay awake for work reasons or for safety reasons, set yourself up for alertness, whether it's countermeasures like light or caffeine. You want to time things appropriately and make sure you have safeguards in place to protect you from poor decision-making or other errors or mistakes. But again, this is just a brief overview of some of these recommendations. You can go to some of these resources for more details. And use what you know when working from home. Like we know a lot of these things already about how to improve sleep health. So you want to keep a regular schedule. A regular schedule can help promote healthy sleep. Get plenty of sleep. Try and prioritize it because it'll help set you up for success during the day. Get plenty of daylight. Natural daylight, even when we're stuck inside, natural daylight can do wonders for circadian rhythms and nighttime sleep, especially in the morning. Get some daytime movement. The data are bearing this out, that the people who are not moving during the day are doing worse. And prioritize. Prioritize your health, prioritize your rhythms, prioritize healthy behaviors, and practice self-care and practice stimulus control. Again, get out of bed if you can't sleep. So that's all I have. Here's a plug for our lab. Here's our lab website. Here's all our students and our funding support for the work that we're doing. And I encourage you to check us out, see what we're working on. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Here's my contact information. Feel free to send me an email, follow me on Twitter. I post stuff almost every day. And I look forward to spending the rest of the time on some questions.
Thank you, Doctor. And we have a number of questions that have come in, and we will try to get them going. But first one is Rita Durgan. Rita, I'm going to try to get you to unmute yourself. There you go. If you can unmute yourself, Rita, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you for the slideshow and all your information. It was very enlightening. I would like to know what you think of melatonin.
So melatonin is a hormone secreted by the pineal gland at night. It essentially sends a nighttime signal to your body, and your body uses it for a lot of different things in that regard. I mean, it's how most of your body knows to get into a nighttime or sleep mode. It does other things too. It's also a very powerful anti-inflammatory in some ways. It's also used in the gut, but from a sleep perspective, that's what it does. It tells your body it's nighttime. Now, a couple of caveats about it. As we get older, we often naturally produce less melatonin. That might mean our body has a weaker nighttime sleep signal at night. Not for everybody, but sometimes that can be an issue. Another thing is when people take melatonin sort of as a supplement, essentially the thing about a melatonin supplement, it's identical to the melatonin you produce in your body, so your body doesn't tell the difference. So the timing and the dose become very important though. So if you're taking melatonin at a time when your body knows it's not nighttime, like you're taking it at noon, it won't really do much because your body knows it's not nighttime. So the melatonin won't have that effect. If you're taking it like at bedtime, when your body already knows it's nighttime, it won't have much of an effect because its effect is that it tells your body it's nighttime. And that's why it's generally not a good treatment at all for insomnia, because most people with insomnia, their body knows it's nighttime. It's just there's still too much activation and they can't relax. So melatonin is usually extremely ineffective for insomnia, but it could be very effective for promoting general sleep health in people who don't have insomnia. It's also really great for shifting rhythms. So taking a low dose melatonin early in the evening can help send a nighttime signal a little early, which makes you kickstarts your natural melatonin secretion a little bit early, which makes you a little more tired a little earlier than usual, but it also wakes you up a little earlier than usual. It shifts your whole schedule over. Same thing if you take a low dose melatonin as soon as you wake up, it can keep your biological night going a little longer, so you stay up a little later the next night. So it's a shifter. There is a potential for a larger dose of melatonin closer to bedtime, maybe like a half an hour to an hour before. For some people, it might be helpful in terms of promoting sleep. A higher dose might be beneficial for older people who are producing less naturally. For some of those people, a time release might also be helpful. The data are still a little bit iffy on it. There's still not a ton of data out, but it seems like for those sorts of cases, a slightly higher dose closer to bedtime might be helpful.
Thank you very much. I do take 10 milligrams nightly, about 30 minutes prior to going to bed after watching a comedy or shutting off my screens 30 minutes early. And it works. It really does help me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so 10 milligrams. So for some people, 10 milligrams is too much where they feel groggy in the morning without it promoting their sleep that much more. But for some people, especially as people get older, 10 milligrams is actually, there's some data on about 10 milligrams helping older adults, especially, or people who might naturally have lower melatonin. There is some data on that. I should also mention some medications will naturally lower melatonin, like a lot of blood pressure medications and beta blockers will reduce melatonin. So that's another case where someone might want to be taking it to make up for what's been suppressed.
Our next question is Michelle Donner. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Michelle, and ask your question. There you go.
Hi, I have a question about keeping sleep structure or just general sleep advice for someone that's unemployed, because a lot of the research out there talks about working from home, but it's hard being unemployed and keeping a structure when you don't have any structure, and my sleep just keeps getting worse and worse, and I already had insomnia before. So.
Yeah, I mean, so my best advice is, it's like you can have a band of very talented musicians, and they can all be playing the same tune, but sometimes you need the drummer to bang out the beat for a measure or two before the rest of the band comes in. And if your body is like that band where they've all got their tune to play and they may know what they're doing, but it's sort of out of sync, you might need to be that drummer to set the beat, to set the rhythm. And you can do that by artificially creating a rhythm. The first place I would start is have a regular wake up time. No matter when you go to bed, have a regular wake up time. And when you wake up, because you can control that. And when you wake up, have the first thing you do is to get some bright light and get some movement. There are biological reasons why that helps set your rhythms for the day, everything from metabolism to energy level and mental functioning. Getting that daytime bright light signal, especially outdoor light. And here in Arizona, we're very lucky that we have a lot of outdoor, natural, highly palatable light that our eyes are looking for. That can help set the rhythms for the day. And then from there, I'd start having some regular meal times or regular active times. Program them in, force them in, and then the rest of the rhythms will start building themselves around them. But if there's no direction, if there's no one to count the beat, everyone's just, all the players are guessing at what the rhythm is. But you can take control of that, and you can, to some degree, artificially create a rhythm, create a pattern that your body is going to learn. Because our brains and our bodies are pattern recognition machines, and when the pattern changes, it's looking for a new pattern. And when there is no pattern, it sort of falls apart and doesn't know what to do. But sometimes just create the pattern artificially and it'll start following it.
Okay. Will that help with all the anxiety around being unemployed and all that?
Well, in terms of helping with anxiety, one of the things that you can do is improved sleep will help, improved rhythms will help. There is data that shows that when you improve sleep, you can improve other mental health symptoms across the board. And certainly without improving sleep, it makes it harder. But also I would say, if you have insomnia, there's a line between just struggles with sleeping and an insomnia disorder. And if it crosses the line where if it's taking more than a half an hour to fall asleep, or you're up for more than a half an hour during the night, most nights, it might be more than something you can just fix on your own with schedules and tips and stuff. And you might need to see someone who's a specialist for insomnia, where the main treatment would be CBTI, where we reprogram your sleep schedule. There are also medications, but the first line treatment is the non-medication approach as often being more effective. And that way you're not on your own with it. And also, like, that's the thing. There's a line between stuff that's easier and more palatable to fix on our own versus something that we need to call in reinforcements. And when the normal stuff doesn't work, that rather than a signal that nothing's going to work, it just means we need to call in some bigger reinforcements. So I do this all the time in clinic, where people have been struggling with stuff for years, and then they come in, whether it's me or anyone else who does this. We help them with their insomnia, and that helps open the door to some of these other things too. And I think that's an important message, because we often get the sense that we're on our own with this, and that the only other option is like someone to throw sleeping pills at it. And that there are actually a lot more options. There's a lot of data out there, and actually being here, for the people who are local in Tucson, Arizona, for people who don't know, has one of the largest contingents of sleep experts in the world. It's just because University of Arizona has always been a major site for sleep research and clinical sleep medicine. So we have a lot of people here who know what they're doing and can help. But that aside, to your main question, getting better sleep may help with stress. And also one way it may is when everything feels upside down and out of order and totally like disintegrated in a mess, creating some order is a good place to start. The term for that in the psychology world is behavioral activation, where when people are sort of at the end of their rope, you say things like, you know what, I can't fix all your problems, but like get up every day, take a shower, get dressed, eat 3 meals. Let's start there and get some success at doing some basic stuff, and then let's add to those successes. So just being able to build some routines is building a place of strength to start from, rather than a place of dysregulation.
Okay. Yeah, I did CBTI last year for a while, and it seemed to help. And then it's just gotten worse the longer the pandemic's gone on. So
yeah. No, if you need help connecting with anybody, send me an email and I'll help connect you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to summarize a few questions that came in regarding the study and other outside influences, like were any of the issues around sort of politics and even use of alcohol increasing during the pandemic, or even depression? Were any of those factors kind of things that came into the studies that you were just working on?
So, I mean, there was the politics issue. I didn't put this in there, but, we had a pandemic at the same time as we had an election, both of which were very stressful for people. And so we did look at that. It's hard to measure, but it does look like it played a role a little bit in people's stresses and their sleep disturbance and some of their nightmares. So, for example, some of the preliminarily, when we looked at some of it, look at the people who were had more political related stress, had more COVID related nightmares, for example, and more dreams about politics. But in terms of alcohol, we did measure that. We haven't looked at those data yet, but clearly there does seem to be an increase in alcohol use, at least anecdotally I'm hearing about, and we'll see what happens when we look at the data. Obviously, we could see that in the Fitbit data because it's not part of that, but in the survey we did, we'll definitely take a look. And I'm sure there are going to be studies that are going to be increasingly coming out on this. Your audio just dropped a little bit a second ago when you. Okay, let me adjust my headset. Is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah, I can't wait till I can sort of be back in the office on a landline and not have to worry about these connection issues. So yeah, I think more data will be coming out on this. I think it's a great question, and definitely something that I plan on looking at in the data we have.
All right. We had a couple questions around, make sure I get the right person. I believe Madeline, I'm going to destroy your name. I apologize. Lori, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. A couple questions came up around chronotype.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I've had this problem all my life. My sleep is not like other people's. And it's just been exaggerated now that I don't have to leave home for work. I don't have to get up and, get ready for work. So I'm just curious. And so I think it's called social jet lag. I've always sort of had that, and now it's just increasing. So I just wondered if you had any comments about different sleep cycles and sleep patterns.
Yeah. So two issues
and how
you
they're
brought up.
faring.
One issue is chronotype and another is social jet lag. So social jet lag, I mentioned very briefly earlier, is when we're here during the week and we shift ourselves on a weekend. We essentially travel to another time zone on the weekends by staying up later and sleeping in later, and then shifting back during the week. So that's social jet lag, where we jet lag ourselves without traveling.
Okay.
And that seems to be reducing on average in the pandemic as weekdays and weekends are coming together more, as people don't have to go to bed as early as they used to sometimes for not getting up early. But the other issue brought up is chronotype. And for people who don't know, chronotype is sort of a way to represent where our biological night is. So everyone's got a part in their day, which is their biological night, which is when their body wants to go to sleep and wants to wake up. And for most people, think of a normal curve where most people are sort of in the typical range of, maybe somewhere between, 10 p.m. and midnight for the start of the biological night, and somewhere between, 5 and 8 a.m. for the end of the biological night. Somewhere in there, there's about an 8-hour window when our body wants to be asleep. But just because most people are here, there's lots of variability within the normal range, and there's people at outliers. There's some people who naturally go to bed very early and wake up early, and some people who are night owls and they naturally go to bed late and stay up late. So like when I look at the clock, if I had like an average sleep rhythm and I looked at the clock and see midnight, my body sees midnight. But someone who's more of a night owl, they look at the clock says midnight, their body says, oh, it's only 9 p.m. So I'm not ready for bed yet. And whereas someone who's very early looks at the clock, it says midnight, oh my gosh, it's 3 a.m. And their body feels like it's later than it is. So it's all shifted. And, during the pandemic, you see this natural trend towards shifting later. Now, for some people, that's a good thing. Younger adults and teenagers and especially kids who have to wake up earlier, who might do better sleeping in, giving them that chance to sleep in is better. I mean, naturally, our biological night shifts later in teenage years and young adulthood. For some people, it sort of stays and hangs out there. And as they get older, they stay to be night owls. But it can get in the way of life. If you need to go to work and things, it can be hard. Biologically, it's not necessarily harmful. It is the case that people who tend to be more night owls, they tend to have more depressive symptoms. They tend to have more problems with social isolation because their peak time is not everyone else's. They tend to miss out on things. But biologically, it doesn't necessarily seem harmful. But if you wanted to shift earlier, I would actually use similar advice to what I said before, is start with your wake up time, get bright light when you wake up, and the light will help shift your rhythms earlier. And you might need sort of there are more specific techniques and more detailed things you can do to help regularize and shift things, but light and also judicious use of melatonin as a shifter can be very helpful in helping people get back to a more normal rhythm.
And another question, James Venska, excuse me. James, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Doctor, hi. I'm curious about not exactly nightmares, but flashbacks to long-term memory situations, events that come back vividly clear. Is that something your study looked at?
No, but it does happen in a couple situations. One is when people are falling asleep, when their mind is sort of wandering and open, and these things come in. Another one is during the night, when people, especially people who've been trauma survivors, when their mind is sort of open and a little more free when you're dreaming and things, sometimes it can hit a nerve and tap into a flashback or a recollection or something, and then it suddenly wakes you up. And sometimes it happens sort of at the end of the night as you're waking up. But it is something that can happen. I mean, and that I think fits into, my guess is that would fit into the data on problems with nighttime awakenings or problems falling asleep. And again, probably tied to stress. And the recommendations around it really are that you might not be able to prevent the nerve from getting hit, like if some raw nerve gets hit, but what you can learn to do potentially is minimize the impact, where it's sort of like, you might not be able to prevent accidentally stubbing your toe or your mind wandering into a place that exposes this flashback or memory or whatever. But what you can do is what you do afterwards. And distraction techniques are great. Relaxation techniques are great. De-escalation techniques, and there's lots of them available, and some of them are more easy to do in bed in the middle of the night than others. So one of the easiest things you can do if you wake up from a very disturbing thought that you're having trouble letting go of would be a distraction technique. I mean, and humor is the best, but if you can just give your mind something else to do for a little bit and let your mind forget what it was holding on to for a minute, it might be an easier way to move on from that and sort of de-escalate. And if you do wake up and your body is very activated, get up. Don't try and fall right back to sleep if you're not going to fall right back asleep. Get up, get a drink of water, walk around. Maybe not get a drink of water if you're going to have to go to the bathroom, but do something out of bed that gives your mind and body some distance from that before you get back in bed.
Next question is from Lindy Elias. Lindy, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question. There you go. You appear to be on, Lindy. Go ahead. Are you able to, is your microphone working, Lindy? Looks like she's having issues. I know that she had been a COVID survivor, is my understanding, and was sort of had interrupted sleep as a result of sort of dealing with the effects of COVID. And I guess wondered if you had any observations on that.
Yeah, two things I can talk about there. One is that a lot of people after having COVID still have problems. One common problem that people have after COVID is pain or other discomforts that don't quite go away. And that can probably disrupt sleep. There's not a lot of data on this yet. I don't know that there's any published data on this yet. I know we're looking to put together a project here to look at this. I think it's an important question. I don't really know what the data are around it, but in terms of things to tell somebody who is experiencing this, I would say the same thing as I would say after any kind of medical condition. Number one, stimulus control. If in the short term, if whatever's happening is preventing you from falling asleep is a barrier, it may go away naturally, or you can treat it, or whatever it is you're doing to address it. Don't let it make your sleep worse. If there's a barrier to sleep and you can't control it, get out of bed. Don't set yourself up to fail by being awake in bed and unable to sleep. It's a hard thing to do in the moment, but trust me, the data are crystal clear on this. If you can be rigorous about not spending time in bed awake when you're not going to be able to sleep, it will protect your sleep long-term and prevent a long-term insomnia from blossoming. Also, in those moments when you're trying to get back to sleep and see if you have to get up or not, or when you're getting back to bed trying to fall back asleep, breathing, deep breathing techniques and breathing exercises can be great because they work very well on your back, and they can not only reduce physical but also mental activation and might make the difference. But at the end of the day, it's, you might need something a little more individually tailored, but I would focus on number one, getting out of bed if you can't sleep. Even if it's hard, trust me, the data are really strong on it, and don't get back into bed again until you're ready to try. Even if you sleep less tonight, you're investing in your lack of sleep problems in the future and resolving sleep problems you have. And the other thing is trying to do some relaxation and mental techniques in bed, especially if you're feeling physical discomfort. A mental exercise might help get you out of your body and back into a relaxed mind. And also, again, if you've crossed the line from just discomfort and problems into an actual insomnia disorder, you might need to get it treated by a professional who's an insomnia expert. I mean, just like, if you're stressed, that's one thing, but if you have a clinical depression, you need to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You probably can't fix it on your own. Same thing with insomnia. But I don't know that you're there. I'm just saying, for anyone out there who is, don't forget that there is help available.
Our next question is from Kimberly Moon. Kimberly, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. Kimberly, if you can unmute yourself. Looks like she may be having issues.
Trying to unmute.
Oh,
Hold
Oh,
on.
there you go. You're doing well. You're on.
Just give me a second to get in a different place. The question I had was, have there been any studies done on children that have PANDAS and PANS? I know my son has PANDAS, and throughout the pandemic, he seems to require even less and less sleep, and he never seems to be tired.
Yeah, I don't know of any data out there, but it does make sense to me, especially when you have these dysregulated rhythms where it's sort of like when the pattern changes and the body's having a hard time recognizing and following these patterns anyway, the pattern, the regularity can sort of disintegrate, especially kids who, when they get tired, they get hyper. When they look like, the more tired they are, the more they sort of get hyperactive even. So
My son is
I
now
wouldn't
in
be
college,
surprised.
so.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah,
okay.
so
But so there, I would imagine. So with that age, we were talking about a late adolescence, early adulthood. My guess is that you have a lot of drive to stay up later, which is again sort of natural chronotype of a college student. And so I wonder if there's all these pushes to stay up later, but not a lot of pushes to sleep more. And I wonder if that could be part of it. Again, I think building, there's a lot to be said for building in some structure and regularity, even when the world doesn't demand it, because your body likes it. And when you don't give it, when you don't feed it a rhythm, it doesn't develop one. And especially if you have somebody who's already predisposed to, dysregulation and being out of balance, you might have to work just a little bit harder to create the balance, even if at first it's artificial balance. You're creating the boundary yourself for the body to sort of develop into. But I mean, that's what I would say. I don't know of data, particularly on developmental disabilities and other issues during the pandemic, except that I can imagine when schedules sort of become disintegrated and structures and support systems become changed, that all kinds of things can start changing and not in a good direction. And so I guess I would, not knowing anything particular about the specific case, because it's not clinical, but for whoever's listening, if they're in a situation, the first thing is to see sort of what supports are no longer there, and what good were they doing that you could then replace. I mean, it's great for a lot of people to not have to wake up early to catch a school bus like they used to, but if they don't have to wake up at all, then that's maybe too much, and then you need to create some structure, because like I said, the body and the brain like structure, especially when it's already struggling. Creating structure, creating boundaries, creating patterns helps reduce that sort of stress and dysregulation. At least that's my.
But how do they my son has never been super tired, even if he has a small amount of sleep.
Well, that could be something else.
With that
I mean,
diagnosis.
yeah, I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole of neurologic and psychiatric conditions and medical conditions related to sleep disruption, and a lot of them cause sleep disruption globally. And so I'm saying in that context, this could be making things worse because it may be removing some of the supports that were actually preventing things from being even worse. And I would say if he's in a situation where it's negatively impacting he's saying in college, his academic performance, mental health, I mean, I would suggest get in touch with somebody who can, rather than try and fix it himself. Maybe this is sort of the result of a medical issue, and someone needs to have their eyes on it and can actually help create the structure that can help support it, because this may or may not be something you can fix on his own. I don't know,
Right.
but if this is in the context of an existing diagnosis that's known to sort of wreak havoc on a lot of regulatory processes and affective regulation and attention and all of these sort of things and activation that can get in the way of sleep. We already know that a lot of these conditions can get in the way of sleep anyway. And my guess is that what's happening is just that whatever supports were in place, some of them aren't even there anymore right now, or things are even worse. And just goes to show that if someone's in a position where it's really impacting their life and it's not just a few tips that can help, go see a sleep specialist. Like, we can help, especially for someone like him. It may be, he's at the borderline of sort of adolescence and adulthood. I'm not quite sure whether, a peds person might be more well-versed in some of the developmental issues. But either way, I think somebody who knows what they're doing can help see what his strengths are and begin to capitalize on those to come from a place of strength. And I would say this to anybody where, there's lots of people out there that this applies to, whether not the specific diagnosis, but any kind of medical issue, chronic pain. A lot of people during the pandemic didn't go to the doctor because they didn't want to get exposed. And so then problems got worse and things and issues started sort of having a life of their own and taking over. And I think especially I want to push the idea that we can do a lot of this stuff remotely. You don't need to come in person to get good sleep help if it's not something you can fix on your own. And for whoever's out there, whatever you're dealing with, whatever conditions you've got, we're here, and we're here to help when the usual stuff like building routines and getting up and getting light and getting movement and building schedules and cutting out screens and like all this stuff. If you've done all that already and you're still running up against walls, maybe it takes a little more. And that's what we're here for.
Thank you.
Our next
Thanks.
question is from Susan Rubin, and a few people have had questions about over the counter, and I know you made a little comment about that, but she has something more specific here. Susan,
Sure.
if you want to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, I just guess I'm curious about the use of CBD oil and marijuana, medical marijuana, particularly since now we also, we have legalized marijuana too, and use it for sleep.
So there's a bit of data, not a ton yet, but there's a bit of data on CBD and THC on sleep. I'll talk about CBD first, in that despite what all the ads say, the data on CBD and sleep is extremely murky and very unclear. It looks like it's highly dependent on the person. It's highly dependent on the dose. And when you combine all the published placebo-controlled data out there, most of the time it doesn't do much of anything for sleep. Sometimes it might help people relax. Sometimes it actually makes sleep worse. So I'm not going to say don't use CBD for sleep. I would just say approach CBD for sleep with appropriate skepticism. But again, it does seem to help some people. But we don't know yet enough about how exactly it's really helping with sleep, so we could better target it to the right person in the right delivery. but it does seem to help some people, but maybe not most people. For THC, that's a different story. THC does seem to have some pretty profound impacts on sleep. It does systematically seem to help people fall asleep faster, stay asleep more solidly. It does also do something that also a lot of antidepressants do, in that it dramatically reduces REM sleep. It's a potent REM sleep suppressor. But for any kind of long-term use, and I don't know exactly where the line from short-term to long-term is, I don't think that's sort of set in stone yet, but the difference between short and long-term use is that over long-term, the effects on sleep start wearing off. So people start chasing higher doses. So it doesn't seem to work long-term. The REM suppression does not wear off though, but the benefits do start wearing off. And so people start chasing higher and higher doses. The other thing is, when people stop using THC as a sleep aid, what happens is their sleep rebounds, just like a sleeping pill, where your sleep gets worse for a couple weeks. And you think, a lot of people think that that's the sleep problem that they were taking this to prevent, and actually their worst sleep problem is actually a withdrawal symptom, and that'll go away on its own. But then they go back to it because they think that they're keeping it at bay. The other thing that happens is people can get profound, really vivid dreams and nightmares because of the REM suppression, and then all of a sudden it's not suppressed anymore. So you get this flood of a REM rebound. So I guess CBD doesn't seem to do much for sleep, might help some people. THC does seem to have effects on sleep, but it has side effects, and it doesn't seem to be a great long-term solution, and can cause withdrawal symptoms when you stop. So there might be a better approach, but it's not nothing. I guess take that for what it's worth. A lot of when I talk about over-the-counter stuff, most over-the-counter stuff for sleep is either, I mentioned melatonin, talked about cannabinoids. There's also any kind of medication that's over-the-counter for sleep is probably an antihistamine like Benadryl. It's just a different version of an antihistamine because histamine promotes alertness. They tend to also not be great long-term. The data on them are quite weak. They could be good for short-term sort of difficulty falling asleep, but long-term they tend not to be very effective. And any kind of herbals, again, the data on them are usually quite weak. Some of them, there is some reasonable data, but the data on a lot of sort of supplements is more about promoting healthy sleep in people who don't really have much in the way of problems or minor problems. But if you have insomnia, the data show that they're just not going to be effective to treat it most of the time, for whatever that's worth.
Next question, Norm Land. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Norm, and ask your question.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier about napping, and I was wondering what the criteria is for napping.
Yeah, so I sort of think of three kinds of naps. The first kind of nap I would call a power nap. This is where you're taking a relatively brief nap of 15 to 30-ish minutes under relatively well-rested conditions, and that part is important because what's happening is you're sleeping and you're staying in a light stage of sleep. If you're more sleep deprived, you're going to drop down into a deeper stage of sleep faster, and you don't want that for a power nap. For a power nap, you're going to get a lot of the benefits of sleep. It can improve alertness, fatigue levels, memory, learning. It can be good for physical and mental function, but you don't want to nap too late or too long. If it's too late, you start getting into a nighttime sleep. And if you nap for too long, again, you start dropping into a deeper stage of sleep. Either one of those conditions leave you waking up feeling groggy, disoriented, and maybe even worse off than not napping at all. So those sorts of naps are good under the right conditions. The second kind of nap, I don't usually advise, but it's a legit form of a nap, is a sort of a sleep replacement nap, sort of like a meal replacement shake. This is where you're budgeting 2 to 3 hours of the day to go through a full sleep cycle. More than that probably isn't replacing much in terms of nighttime sleep, but you can make up for some lost nighttime sleep. At least that's what the data suggests, by getting a full cycle during your non-biological nighttime. But you get diminishing returns more than that, really. And you know what, an hour and a half of sleep might require 2.5 hours during the day to get that same level of recovery. So it's not ideal, but it's possible. College students do this all the time. And people who are shift workers use this kind of nap a lot. It can be helpful. The third kind of nap is the one that is not associated with good outcomes. This is what I would call is a nap of necessity, where you're napping because you can't stay awake. And that's usually a sign that something is wrong with your sleep at night. I mean, it's normal to have a dip in the afternoon and take a siesta, but again, that's under relatively well-rested conditions. That's normal. But if you're having trouble keeping your eyes open for a significant portion of the time, and you're nodding off even when you don't want to be, that's a sign that something's up, and that's what's associated with bad health outcomes, because it's a sign that your sleep is not healthy, and so your body is not able to do what it needs to do during sleep to maintain optimal functioning. So those are three kinds of nap. Power nap, totally fine. Not too long, not too late. You'll get benefits. You won't get tons of benefits, but you'll get some real important measurable benefits if you do it right. Sleep replacement nap is sort of like a shift workers thing, where they'll get a few hours, catch a few hours during the day. Could be good, but you get diminishing returns. And then you have the necessity nap, where because you can't stay awake, that's a sign that you've got a problem.
One quick question here. We're running out of time, but we have
Sure.
a comment about using yellow lenses in glasses, and I assume that's related to screen time and things like that. I know a lot of phones now have sort of night mode and different things. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I talked about light sending a daytime signal, and it works with the melatonin system. And at night, you want the brain to know that it's nighttime. But instead, if you give it bright light that it thinks is sunlight, it's going to get a little confused, and it's going to be harder to fall asleep. Now, for most of human history, this was not a problem. Once we invented artificial lights, actually, it still mostly wasn't a problem, because the older lights were very yellow. And it turns out that the light that the eye uses to tell the brain that it's daytime is in the blue-green spectrum. White is included, because whiting has all the colors in it. So they've developed ways to specifically block out the blue and bluish and greenish light that sends that daytime signal to the brain. You can either do it by dimming the screen and filtering that out on the screen itself, or probably even better, wearing glasses that filter it out at your eye. Now, what it looks like is these can be extremely effective in filtering out the light that sends the daytime signal to the brain, but it depends on the color of the lenses. If the lenses are more of a red-orange color, you're probably fine. If they're more of a yellow color or a brown or gray color, they're probably not filtering out enough of the blue-green light to be maximally effective, probably some. And if you can see blue or green colors through the lenses, it's not filtering out the blue light. So if you hold up, if you're wearing the glasses and you are looking at a blue picture and you can see the sky and it looks blue, it's not filtering out the blue light enough. So that's a good rule of thumb. If the lenses are orange, it's probably filtering out enough of the blue light. If you can see blue, it's probably not. But they can be effective, but it only prevents the light stimulation function. The screens also keep you mentally engaged and distracted and emotionally involved, and all those things, obviously, it doesn't really do that much with. But it does block that daytime stimulating function of the light.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Grandner. And this is
No, thank you for having me.
a lot of great information, and we really appreciate it, and appreciate the partnership with the Department of Psychiatry and all of this as well. And we do have 2 more events in our speaker series coming up, and we just put the link in the chat for that. And do you have any other parting thoughts or words for us? And we do plan to get this recording up on our website on that same mental health page. And we can look for some other tips and things maybe to add to that. But thank you again for your time, and just, yeah, any last comments?
Just that to consider sleep as an investment in your health and functioning, not just how much time you have left in the day. Think of your sleep as a part of how you're going to feel tomorrow. So if you make time to wind down, get the sleep you need tonight, you'll feel better tomorrow, and it's worth the investment in yourself. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you again for your time, and everybody have a wonderful week. And for our OLLI members, we'll see you in class. Take care, and we'll see you on the next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.